Hi everyone, and welcome to Horror Spectator. If you're new here, consider subscribing. We dive deep into the darkest, most chilling real-life horror stories out there. And if you're a returning viewer, I'm so glad to have you back, friend. In this video, we're exploring 3 stories from people who grew up in the most remote parts of the Appalachian Mountains and went through truly terrifying experiences. From families who ventured into the woods and found something that would haunt them for life, to people living in isolation whose homes were suddenly invaded. These stories are deeply unsettling, and I hope they leave you as disturbed as they left me. Now, dim the lights, get comfortable, and let's head back into the mountains. And remember, viewer discretion is advised. The story I'm about to tell you happened over 25 years ago, when I was about 7. I spent my entire childhood in Greenback, Tennessee. It wasn't until I left for work years later that I finally moved away from that area. I never really had complaints about living there, especially because back then it was common for all the kids to play outside together, and there was a sense of freedom I missed deeply. But we were in the Appalachian Mountains, so while you had freedom in some things, you didn't in others. My father was always deeply religious, and because of that, our family went to church every week. I remember clearly that the walk there was very short, only about 5 minutes if we cut through the woods. But my father used to say the forest was evil, that creatures lived there capable of making us do terrible things. So we would take the long way around, nearly a 30-minute walk, just to avoid it. My mother, on the other hand, wasn't afraid of the woods. During the day, when my father was at work, she often let me play there with the other kids. As long as I didn't wander too far from the house or the village and was careful, she didn't mind. So I lived in this strange middle ground. My father saw evil and coldness everywhere and clung to the church with all his strength, while my mother saw the forest as sacred, something that could help us if we respected it. But one thing my mother was just as strict about as my father was, that I should never leave the house, especially toward the woods, after sunset. It wasn't just her, though. Everyone in the village locked themselves inside once night fell, bolting their doors tightly. During the long winter nights, when it was already dark by 5 p.m., everything around us turned silent, deserted, stripped of any sign of life. There weren't many children in our area, so we all stuck together. Older ones, younger ones, everyone. The older kids always had secrets, and for any of us younger ones desperate to grow up faster, those secrets were like magnets, impossible to resist. I was always trying to hang around the older kids, hoping to learn their plans, to find a way to be part of their group. One day, I overheard them talking about a castle near our village. They said it was a place where the devil himself had tried to live twice. They wanted to explore it at night. The idea terrified me, and clearly terrified them too. But they all agreed to do it anyway. I knew that if they found out I'd overheard them, they would change their plans just to avoid me ruining everything. And if I asked to join them, they would have laughed in my face and said no. Billy, the oldest in the group, was 14 and very protective of us younger kids. He constantly put himself at risk, like any bored 14-year-old with too much freedom. But when it came to us, he was like an older brother. If he knew I was planning to follow them, he would have found a way to trick me out of it. So I kept my distance for the next few days, pretending I didn't know anything. When the night finally came, I told my parents I had a stomachache and wanted to go to bed early. I was surprised when it worked. They wished me good night and left me alone, completely unaware of what I was about to do. Hidden under my bed, I already had a small bag packed. A few of my mom's cookies I had stolen after pretending to eat them. A bottle of water, a blanket, and a flashlight I'd taken from my dad's shed. I was just a kid, completely unprepared for what happened next. They had agreed to leave their houses and meet behind the church at 10 p.m. I didn't want to risk being late, so I left home around 8:30, and by 9 I was already at the church, hiding behind some bushes, waiting for them. My plan was to reveal myself only once we were already deep in the woods. Billy wouldn't send me home alone at that point, so he'd have no choice but to let me stay. At least that's how my childish mind reasoned. The walk to the church was terrifying. At first, I wanted to cut through the forest, just to prove to myself that I could do it. But then I remembered my mother's face, her begging me not to go into the woods after dark. If I was already breaking my promise to her, the least I could do was minimize the risk. And honestly, I was terrified. So I took the long route, the same one my family used to take, avoiding the few houses along the way. I didn't want anyone looking out their window and recognizing me. If my parents ever found out what I'd done, they would never let me out of their sight again, and my father would surely punish me. When I finally arrived, it was a little past 9, and they hadn't shown up yet. So I hid behind the bushes and waited. The night was suffocatingly silent and frightening. Every sound felt louder, sharper. Somewhere far away, I could hear something. Like a woman singing, or maybe screaming, or something in between. I couldn't really tell what it was, but I knew it came from deep within the forest, and it made my skin crawl. When they finally started arriving, one by one, I felt slightly better. At least I wasn't alone anymore. They were clearly scared too, whispering about the same sound I had heard, but none of them wanted to be the one to suggest turning back. So when the last boy, Jack, showed up, they started walking, and I quietly followed from behind. The deeper we went, the louder that sound became. I didn't even know exactly what they planned to do there, only that they wanted to reach that old castle. I remember feeling the air around us change completely as we moved forward. I was petrified, barely able to see the others ahead of me through the dense darkness of the woods. The air was heavy, and the cold was unlike anything I'd ever felt. I thought about wrapping myself in the blanket, but it would have just gotten caught on branches, so I left it in the bag. When we finally reached the castle, I stayed back. I watched them light a small fire and explore the place. I wanted so badly to join them, to feel the warmth of that fire. But then, from the distance, I saw her. I'll never forget that sight. She stood far away, wearing a large black hat with a veil, a long black dress, like she'd just walked out of a funeral from another century. And she made that same horrible sound. It pierced right into our heads, a mix between a song and a scream. And it came from everywhere at once. From the forest, from the air, from inside us. I wasn't the only one hearing it. I saw them turning their heads in every direction, trying to find where it was coming from. And when they finally saw her, everything happened at once. They all started running, scattering in every direction. I tried to run too, but the sound was so loud, so unbearable, it paralyzed me. I crouched down where I was, pressed my hands over my ears to block it out, and started crying. I don't know how long I stayed there, until I realized the sound had stopped, and that woman in black was gone. Little by little, I pulled myself together, and still crying, made my way home. When I got back, I climbed the small ladder up to my window and spent the rest of the night trembling in bed. The next morning, when my mother came to check on me, she found me still in my clothes, shivering, pale, and freezing cold. She thought I was having some sort of breakdown and called one of our neighbors, a woman known for making herbal remedies that were said to help with such things. When my father saw her in the house, he lost his temper and made her leave. But before she did, I saw it in her eyes. She knew. She knew what had happened to me the moment she touched my hand. My mother noticed too, and asked her what she had seen. The woman simply said she had seen death, but that it wasn't my time yet. That same day, the news came that Billy had gone missing. The other boys admitted they'd gone into the forest, but they left out that they'd reached the castle, or that they had seen that woman in black. I never told anyone I'd been there too, or that I'd seen everything, except for the moment Billy disappeared. Over the years, I've tried to push that memory as far away as I could, but sometimes it comes back, along with the trembling. Billy was never found and no trace of him ever surfaced again. The story I'm about to tell you happened not that long ago, maybe 6 or 7 years back. I was 13, still living in the same old house where I'd grown up, in a quiet corner of the Appalachians. My parents owned this big property, more like an old farmhouse really, surrounded by woods that seemed endless when you stood on the porch at night. It was November, the kind of cold that eats through your clothes, and that night was the first time I'd ever been left there alone. I had stayed in the main house by myself several times before, but never on the property itself. There was always at least one worker around. That's why I say that was the only night I was truly alone on that piece of land, completely isolated. My grandmother had fallen seriously ill, and my parents decided to drive to Knoxville to see her. It wasn't supposed to be a long trip. They said they'd be back late, maybe around midnight. I told them I'd be fine, even joked that I was finally old enough to handle being on my own. But the truth is, I didn't mean it. I had never liked being alone in that house. It was too big, too old, too quiet and loud at the same time. The air itself was absolutely silent, but the house was ancient. It made noise everywhere. You couldn't walk through it without someone hearing exactly where you were. But I also didn't want to go see my grandmother. When I was younger, I hated seeing people sick. It almost caused me physical pain to see others suffering, so I avoided it as much as I could. My mother always understood that more sensitive side of me. I think she was a bit like that herself. So she agreed to let me stay, as long as I was careful. Before they left, they locked all the doors and windows, explained exactly what I should do if something went wrong, and then drove off. At first, I stayed in my room. But when the sun started going down, I turned on all the lights in the house. Every single one. The place felt like a museum. Rooms no one really used anymore. Doors that creaked no matter how slowly you opened them. That kind of stillness that makes your ears ring. Around 7:30, I made myself a sandwich and sat in the living room with the TV on, just for the noise. The heater was running, the pipes were groaning, and for a while, it all blended into the familiar soundtrack of an old house settling for the night. It wasn't any different from other nights, and that calmed me a little. It must have been around 8 p.m. when I first felt it. That strange, quiet awareness that something was off. At first, I thought it was just my paranoia and my fear of the dark. Then I figured it might be the wind starting to pick up. It always made weird noises in the strangest places. We had a storm coming that week, and sometimes it pushed against the windows hard enough to rattle the glass. But then I heard it again. A sound I'd heard thousands of times in that house. But one that wasn't supposed to happen if I was alone. A floorboard creaking somewhere down the hall. I turned off the TV to try to hear better. The silence that followed was suffocating. I was just about to turn the TV back on when I heard it again. Closer this time. Someone was inside the house. I was absolutely sure of it. That was the sound of someone walking carefully. I'd made that same annoying sound myself when I didn't want my parents to know I'd gone to the kitchen to sneak snacks. I was completely certain someone was in the house with me. For a few seconds, I just stood there frozen, trying to think of what to do. Then I heard the unmistakable sound of a door closing softly upstairs. And the lights went out. Someone had touched the panel. That's when I realized I was in danger. Not only was I not alone, but there was more than one person there with me. My father's study was right beside the living room. It was his favorite place in the house. A room full of old furniture, shelves stacked with books that smelled like dust and tobacco, and a massive stone fireplace. When I was younger, I used to crawl behind it. There was a narrow gap hidden by a loose wooden panel, just wide enough for me to squeeze through if I turned sideways. I don't even think my father knew that when I was little and wanted to feel closer to him. I used to hide there sometimes. I got up from the couch and started walking as quietly as I could. The panic was absolute. I didn't know if they were behind me, if they could see me or not. The house was completely dark, and I was moving more by memory than by sight. When I finally reached the study, I felt a tiny bit of relief. Maybe they hadn't seen me. Maybe I still had time to hide. I slipped inside, holding my breath. The space was cramped and freezing, but my body felt like it was on fire. The rough stones pressed into my back, and I could smell the faint metallic scent of soot. Through a thin crack between the panels, I could see a sliver of the study. The footsteps came again. Heavier now. Deliberate. They weren't even trying to hide that they were inside the house with me anymore. They moved from the hallway into the kitchen, then the dining room, and finally toward the study. My heart was pounding so hard it felt like it would give me away. I could hear distant noises, and then I heard the study door open. I was sure they were going to find me. My heart was beating so loud it was all I could hear, and I felt like I was about to cry. I had to cover my mouth and nose with my hand to muffle the urge to sob. I heard him step inside the study. I could hear his footsteps and his breathing. I think even today, that sound is what terrifies me the most. More than the creaking floors or the doors. The slow, steady breathing of someone who wasn't afraid. Someone who knew exactly what he was doing. The complete opposite of my panic and fear. The floorboards creaked closer and closer until he was standing right there, in the middle of the study. I could see the shadow of his legs through the crack. He was tall. I watched him stop, turn toward the window, then back toward the fireplace. He was looking for me. I don't know how I didn't cry, gasp, or just run. My fingers dug into the cold stone behind me until my nails hurt. He moved closer. I saw him bend down and look directly at me. I think for a few seconds my heart actually stopped. I could only see his eyes. The rest of his face was covered by a black mask. I thought he was going to grab me and drag me out of there, but instead, he put his finger to his lips and told me to stay quiet. Then he stood up and walked toward my father's desk. Minutes passed. Maybe more. I couldn't tell anymore. I could hear him moving papers around on the desk, then walking toward the door again. Every time he stopped, my whole body went still. I didn't know why he'd told me to stay silent. Was he protecting me from the others? Then suddenly, there was silence. I don't know how long I stayed there, motionless but trembling, until finally I heard the crunch of tires on the gravel driveway, so it could be my parents' car. Headlights flashed through the front windows. My parents came inside calling my name. They must have seen things scattered everywhere and assumed the worst. I wanted to answer them, to run out and hug them, but I couldn't move. To this day, I've never felt fear as paralyzing as that. I heard both of them shouting, panicked, and I think it was the desperation in their voices that finally made me drag myself out and collapse in the middle of the study. My mother found me a few minutes later, yelling for my father and hugging me tight. I could feel her body trembling too. When my dad came in, he grabbed me and started checking me over, maybe looking for signs that I'd been hurt. The police were called, something practically unheard of around there. And only after a good 2 hours of being comforted by my mother did I feel my heartbeat finally slow down. They asked me to talk to them, asked several questions, and then left. They never discovered who had broken into our house, or why they touched my father's desk. Nothing else ever happened after that. We changed the locks, got an alarm system, and installed several cameras around the property. I try to forget that night. I've tried staying alone in the house again, but no matter what I do, I still can't shake the fear. I still hear those footsteps in my head sometimes. The breathing. All I can do is hope that time will help me forget and move on. About 15 years ago, maybe a little more, I went on a hike in the Appalachians with my parents that I'll never forget. I was just a kid, maybe 10 years old, and I was already used to doing that kind of thing with them. We always lived close to the woods, and both my parents were into climbing and camping. There were times of the year when we'd go camping almost every weekend, or whenever they could get time off. I loved it. Genuinely. And it gave me survival knowledge that's priceless for someone who grows up around those areas. Over the years, we'd run into a few weird people out there. so my parents were always extra careful, especially with me. But nothing could have prepared us for what was about to happen. I was young and incredibly curious. My parents had actually encouraged that. They taught me to always wonder about how and why things were the way they were. It built a kind of confidence in me that could be either amazing or dangerous if it wasn't kept in check. Basically, it made me someone who believed I could do anything I set my mind to. But it also made me an insufferable teenager who'd put himself in risky situations just because I could. That time, it was November, and it was raining pretty hard. At first, we hadn't planned to go that weekend, but the weather cleared up a bit, so we went anyway. From the start of the hike, my dad seemed uneasy. He mentioned it several times until, by the end of the first day, he told my mom he felt like something was off and maybe we should turn back. They both agreed something didn't feel right, so they decided we'd camp there for the night to avoid hiking in the dark, and then head back the next morning. Needless to say, we should have turned around the moment he felt uncomfortable, and that was entirely my fault. I'd felt uneasy too, like we were being watched the whole time, but I didn't want to show fear in front of my parents, so I kept quiet. That night, we did what we always did. My parents built a small fire, we cooked dinner, and we read a bit before going to sleep. One thing we always did was never bring our shoes inside the tent. We'd leave them right at the entrance. I'm sure most people do that, but it's an important detail for what happened next. The three of us were sleeping in the same tent, and I've never been a sleepwalker. I've always been a heavy sleeper. But that night, I woke up to my mom shaking me around 3:30 in the morning, asking why I'd been walking outside the tent. At first, I had no idea what she was talking about. Then, she explained she had gotten up to go to the bathroom and noticed the ground covered in footprints from my boots. Prints that hadn't been there when we went to bed. Still half asleep, I told her I hadn't gotten up. I'd been there the whole time. I peeked outside, and my dad was already out there, looking at my boots and the footprints. It had drizzled a little after we went to bed, so the ground was damp enough to show tracks. Not only were there footprints everywhere, but my boots were covered in mud. I was stunned, and for a few seconds, I even doubted myself, wondering if I'd actually gotten up without realizing it. But no, I'd never leave the tent at night without one of my parents. Not out of fear or insecurity, but because if I did and got caught, I'd definitely be grounded. At that point, all three of us were awake, trying to figure out if I had somehow gotten up in my sleep, when suddenly we heard the sound of a child laughing in the distance. It was a soft, sweet kind of laugh, but in that context, it was absolutely terrifying. We all froze, trying to figure out where it was coming from. And then I saw her, a little girl, hiding behind a small bush. I grabbed my dad's arm and pointed, but he just asked what I was pointing at. I asked if he didn't see the girl, and he looked at me with an expression of pure panic that told me everything I needed to know. Then the laughter came again, and both my parents turned in circles, searching for the sound. They couldn't see her. Being stupid, I walked closer to her, and by the time I was within arm's reach, my parents came running after me. Everything happened so fast. She grabbed me by the neck with a strength that no child could possibly have. I felt like she was about to snap it when my dad pulled me back, yelling and dragging me in the opposite direction. I felt myself starting to lose consciousness from how tight her grip was. And that's when my mom showed up with a burning stick from the fire and started swinging it at whatever had me. The girl let go immediately and let out a deep, guttural scream that didn't belong to a child. My parents grabbed me and pulled me toward the fire, throwing on more wood and trying to make it burn brighter. Whatever had grabbed me had backed off from the flames, so that fire was our best shot at surviving the night. All through the night, we kept hearing that laugh again, and more than once, I felt the urge to follow it. It was like it was calling to me. That's why I had walked toward it in the first place. It hadn't just been stupidity. It had pulled me somehow, in a way my parents couldn't feel. It was the most terrifying night of our lives. For a while after, my throat would still hurt from the pressure of whatever had choked me. My dad looked like a broken man. My mom kept glancing at me over and over, like she needed to make sure I was still there. At the first sign of daylight, we packed up only the essentials and left. My dad tied a rope around each of us, my mom in front, me in the middle, and him at the back. We walked as fast as we could toward the car. Once inside, my mom said we weren't ever going to talk about what happened again. Whatever it was, it had stayed behind. My dad and I just agreed. Him relieved to leave it all behind, and me because I didn't even know what had really happened. I had no idea that I'd replay that night in my head thousands of times since then. There were times when I became obsessed with it, and other times I managed to forget for a few days, only for it to come rushing back out of nowhere. Twice, I woke up crying and gasping for air, feeling like I was being choked again. I'm telling this now because about 2 weeks ago, it happened again. I woke up in a panic, feeling like I couldn't breathe. When I went to the bathroom to splash some cold water on my face, I saw the marks on my neck. The exact same ones that had been left there 15 years earlier. I don't know what that means, but I'm terrified it might happen again while I'm asleep. I honestly don't know what to do. About 6 years ago, when I was 14, something happened on our family farm in the Appalachians that changed the way I move through the world. These days, I'm a lot more wary than I ever used to be. Our house sat alone on a ridgeline, reached by a long gravel drive. The nearest town was half an hour away, if the gravel felt like cooperating. That night, the sky opened up and just kept going. Rain came down in sheets, hammering the tin roof, and turning the yard into a wash of black water. My little sister was 9 then, and she'd invited a friend over because the girl's parents were out of town and had no one else to leave her with. They'd called my parents and asked if Rachel could stay the night. I saw something in my mother's face when she agreed, a flicker of hesitation that wasn't like her. She said yes, of course, but her smile didn't quite reach her eyes. It was strange. My sister had had friends sleep over plenty of times before, and I'd had mine too. My mother had never looked uneasy about it until then. I'd met Rachel before. She'd been over many times, and yet something about her always rubbed me the wrong way. It wasn't anything you could name exactly. Just the way she smiled a little too long at the wrong moments, or how her quietness felt measured instead of shy. I couldn't have said why. But months earlier, I'd overheard my parents talking in the kitchen, voices low. My mother admitted she felt uneasy around Rachel, though she didn't know why. That confession stuck with me like a warning sign I hadn't yet learned to read. That night, when everything truly began, it was already late. I remember checking the clock when the phone rang. It was after 11. My father's voice on the line said something about being stranded at the train station 2 towns over. That his car had broken down, and he needed my mother to come pick him up. I remember the way the rain blurred the windows into trembling streaks of light as she grabbed her coat. She kissed our foreheads without saying anything that mattered, bundled herself into the car, and drove off down the mud road toward the highway. She promised it would be quick, that she'd be back before we knew it. We'd been left alone before, though never overnight. All the doors and windows were locked tight. There was no real reason to be nervous, except for the fact that Rachel was there. That alone was enough to make me uneasy in a way I couldn't name. Almost as soon as our mother's car disappeared into the storm, we began to hear noises outside. At first I thought it must be her. Maybe she'd forgotten something and turned back. But the minutes passed, and the front door didn't open. I'd heard the car leaving, but not coming back. I crept to the kitchen window, the one with the best view of the front yard, and lifted the blind just enough to peek out. The night was still and black, the rain like smoke against the glass. Nothing moved, so I lowered the blind again and returned to the living room. A little while later, the sounds came again. At first, they could be explained away. The wind, maybe branches brushing the siding. Then they changed, became sharper, more deliberate. A hand testing the deadbolt. The metallic scrape of knuckles dragging across the porch rail. The house felt suddenly smaller, like a throat tightening. My sister pressed herself against me, and in that moment, I knew there was no pretending anymore. Someone was trying to get inside. I tried to reassure her that everything would be fine. That's when I looked at Rachel. Her expression froze me. There was no fear on her face, only a strange excitement. A light in her eyes that didn't belong to a child. While my sister trembled beside me, Rachel seemed almost eager. She watched the dark shape of the doorway, like someone waiting for a long-expected guest. A smile flickered and returned again and again, quiet and private. When I looked closer, I saw that her eyes were cold and empty, like something had hollowed her out from the inside. My stomach turned. The sounds outside grew louder. Someone was pressing against the back door now, then testing the side windows, moving around the house in a slow, methodical rhythm. We moved like mice through the hallways, closing doors softly behind us, listening for each new scrape. My sister whispered questions through her tears, and Rachel answered them calmly, nodding as if she already knew exactly what would happen next. Her poise made my skin crawl. I looked straight into her eyes and asked, barely managing to get the words out, if she knew who was out there. She didn't blink. Then, in a voice that was flat and certain, she said yes, that it was her uncle, and that he collected children. The air left my lungs. My sister didn't seem to understand what that meant, but I did. I asked if it was the same uncle her parents didn't like, and Rachel smiled and nodded. Then, without hesitation, she stood up from where we were hiding in the kitchen and started walking calmly down the hall toward the front door. I realized what she meant to do just in time. She was going to let him in. I lunged and grabbed her before she reached the handle. She started screaming, a wild, piercing sound that shattered the air. She screamed as if I were the one attacking her, when in truth she was the danger, to all of us. While she shrieked, I shouted for my sister to help me. Terrified, she understood instantly. Together we dragged Rachel down the hall and locked her in my bedroom. Then I told my sister we had to hide in the bathroom at the far end of the house, the one with the strongest door. It was our best chance if the person outside broke in. Whoever it was no longer tried to be quiet. Heavy blows landed against the windows, then the doors, each one echoing through the walls. When we finally slammed the bathroom door shut behind us, we heard glass breaking. A single sharp crack. The only window in the house that wasn't reinforced, the small one in the basement. Rachel's uncle was inside. Almost instantly, Rachel began to laugh. High, shrill laughter that didn't sound human. Her joy was so grotesque it froze my blood. I think it was that sound that saved us. Before he came looking for us, her uncle must have gone to her first. We heard her shrieking with delight as something heavy hit my bedroom door. He was trying to get to her, and in that chaos we caught the faint, distant wail of sirens. It took me a few seconds to realize what it was. The police. I barely recognized the sound. It belonged on TV, not outside our house in the middle of nowhere. And the strangest part was, we hadn't called them. They shouted for us through the door, but we couldn't stop screaming long enough to answer. Finally, they broke it down. I could still hear Rachel's laughter somewhere in the house. That awful, unbroken sound. But I didn't know if her uncle was still there. We only left the bathroom when the officers forced the door open and found us trembling in the bathtub. My parents arrived soon after. They had been the ones to call the police. When my mother reached the train station to get my father, they discovered that someone had slashed his tires. Someone wanted to keep him from coming home, or wanted both of them gone. They'd decided to call the police, just in case. Thank God they did. I don't know what would have happened if they hadn't. Rachel's parents were called in that same night for questioning. They were released the next morning, but Rachel was taken to a psychiatric hospital. None of us ever learned exactly why. We never saw her again, or her parents. 2 weeks later, her uncle was caught in Pennsylvania after trying to rob a gas station. It went bad. Since then, nothing else has happened. But what terrifies me still is the not knowing what he wanted that night, and whether he might come back to finish what he started, him or Rachel. She'd be 15 or 16 by now.